I came to the conclusion that there are two interesting targets, the bridge in the east and the ammunition depots above. The bridge in the east is hard to reach, it's a rather small target, but the Taurus can do it. The ammunition depots can also be hit. If we consider the bridge, I don't think Taurus is enough, and we need to have an idea of how it might work, and for that we need satellite data. I don't know if we can train the Ukrainians for such a task in a short time, and we are talking about a month. What would a Taurus attack on the bridge look like? From an operational perspective, I can't estimate how quickly the Ukrainians will be able to learn how to plan such an action, and how quickly integration will occur. But since we are talking about the bridge and military bases, I understand they want to get them as soon as possible.
Well, these are quite astonishing revelations, really. This points to Germany's direct involvement in the conflict in Ukraine, something which they've gone to great lengths to deny. Now, as we've heard in the transcript, they're talking about the destruction and attack on the Crimean Bridge. Now, this has been a frequent target of both Ukraine and its Western backers, and Germany, or the German military officials, discussed the strategic and military importance of such an attack. Now, they're talking about the Taurus missile. This is the long-range missile that there's been some dithering from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz over the supply of it. If you remember that Germany had to be pretty much forced into supplying the Leopard tanks. It came under great pressure from the United States, and now it's coming under pressure to supply the Taurus missile. There's a lot of explaining to do, but as we understand, Berlin has declined to comment on the accusations. They talk about sneaking in through Poland so that nobody notices, and they discuss about how they're going to get the missiles into Ukraine, if indeed they can get the missiles into Ukraine.
Gerhard, it doesn't matter. We need to ensure that from the very beginning there is no mention that would make us part of the conflict. I am exaggerating a bit, but if we tell the minister now that we plan meetings and will drive by car from Poland so that no one notices, that's already participation and we won't do that.
They talk about the Brits and how they managed to get the Storm Shadow, of course the British long-range missiles, into the country. But there was another interesting exchange when it comes to the efforts of disassociating the German armed forces from direct involvement in the conflict.
Just a moment. I understand what you're talking about. The direct closed connection between Bukel and Ukraine might concern politicians, which could lead to direct involvement in the Ukrainian conflict. In that case, it can be said that information exchange will occur through MBDA, and we will send one or two of our specialists to Schrobenhausen. Of course, this is cunning, but from a political standpoint, it may look different. If information exchange happens through the manufacturer, it's not related to us.
Now, we've heard about this attempt to travel by car through Poland so that nobody notices, but they also talk about the information exchange, and they say that this information exchange can take place between Ukraine and MBDA. This is the arms manufacturer responsible for developing the Taurus missile. This could take place at the Buchel Air Base in Germany. This is a German Air Force base, but it would take place with technicians that they talk about, bringing them in, which would disassociate the armed forces from that information exchange. These satellite images, which they say can be processed at Bucha. Now, this gives information about targets and the accuracy range of around 3 meters. So this is the kind of information, this detailed information, that would be needed to carry out a strike on the Crimean Bridge. They talk a lot about the Brits and these Storm Shadows, about how they managed to use them inside Ukraine, but they spoke about the mounting on aircraft, particularly they spoke about the F-16s. They also, in the discussion, said that, well, this is a slow process. Should Olaf Scholz decide tomorrow that he's going to send these Taurus missiles, it would take about 8 months for them to be able to be activated, because they require a lot of training. The Ukrainian forces don't have the skills to launch such weapons, and it would take time for them to be trained to do so. They also talk about these fears over perhaps a mistake if the Ukrainian forces are able to fire the Taurus missile. They talk about striking kindergartens. Now, those of us that have been on the ground in the Donbass, in the Donetsk Republic, have seen that actually these mistakes are not necessarily mistakes. They seem to happen fairly often. But these, this would, I guess, disassociate the German armed forces with the direct involvement. But we also heard about possible support on the ground.
Do you think it is possible to hope that Ukraine will be able to do everything on its own? After all, it is known that there are many people there in civilian clothes who speak with an American accent. So it is quite possible that they will soon be able to use it themselves. After all, they have all the satellite images.
So there we heard the use of the term cunning. Now this is an interesting term, and we can be sure that the people on the ground in civilian clothes with American accents aren't in Ukraine on a sightseeing tour. They're not, they're not there to see the sights of Ukraine. And as was hinted at there, they could actually help with the deployment of such attacks that we're talking about, including on the Crimean Bridge.
Steve, but in terms of the Ukraine conflict, would these new weapon supplies really change anything on the ground?
Well, that's a great question and an interesting one, because you'll see from the conversations that Germany doesn't want to send all of the Taurus missiles at once, which indicates that this really isn't about winning. This isn't really about victory in Ukraine. And the discussion between the military leaders show that it's simply just Germany's term after Britain has supplied the Storm Shadow and France has supplied the Scout missiles.
If you give 50 pieces, they will be used up very quickly.
Exactly. It won't change the course of the war. That's why we don't want to hand them all over, and not all at the same time. Maybe 50 in the first tranche, then maybe there will be another tranche of 50 missiles. That's perfectly understandable, but it's all big politics. I'm guessing what's really behind it. I have learned from my French and British colleagues that, in fact, with these Storm Shadow and Scalp, it is the same as with the Winchester rifles. They may ask, why should we supply the next batch of missiles? Because we have already supplied them. Let Germany do it now. Perhaps Mr. Frostetta has something to say on this subject?
There's now a general acceptance, even among Western leaders, that Ukraine is losing, that it can't actually win this conflict. We've seen recently the liberation of Avdiivka. We've seen Russian advances along the front line. And of course, this comes off the back of Ukraine's failed counteroffensive, which was backed to the hilt by the West. And they've seen a lot of their military hardware going up in flames on the battlefield. So there may be a kind of a reluctance for this continued supply of military aid. So really, this just looks like an attempt to save face, an attempt at unity in what looks the face of a certain defeat.